Welcome back, gentlemen. Welcome back to this channel where we travel together, not just through history, but through the kind of history that makes you stop and wonder how it is possible that so few people remember it. Today, we are going to talk about something that I promise you will stay with you long after this video ends, and I want to begin with a question. One I'd like you to hold in your mind as we go. What would it feel like to be seated in a pressurized cabin at 20,000 feet, somewhere above the Atlantic seaboard in 1940, with a glass of chilled champagne in your hand, gazing through a curved panoramic window at a moonlit sky completely free of clouds, while the world below you slept in total ignorance that such a thing was even possible? Because that is not a fantasy. That is not a scene from a novel or a film. That happened. It happened aboard one of the most extraordinary aircraft ever built, an aircraft so far ahead of its time that the world barely knew what to do with it when it arrived, and had no idea what it had lost when it disappeared. It was called the Boeing 307 Stratoliner, and this is its story. Let us begin not with the aircraft itself, but with what it felt like to board one. Imagine the year is 1940. You are a man of means, perhaps a business executive, a diplomat, a senior government official, or simply someone wealthy enough to afford what was then, without question, the most exclusive form of transportation in existence. You arrive at a terminal, at Los Angeles, or at New York's LaGuardia Field. And you are not rushing. No one rushes here. The pace is different. There is a particular quality to the air in those terminals, something between a grand hotel lobby and a private club, where the staff knows your name and the lighting is warm and low. You are traveling with TWA, Transcontinental and Western Air, soon to be known as Trans World Airlines, and you have booked passage aboard their flagship, the Boeing 307 Stratoliner. Your ticket has cost you something in the neighborhood of $150 for a one-way transcontinental crossing. In today's money, that is close to $3,000 for a single flight. And yet the people around you do not seem troubled by the price. They seem, if anything, entirely at ease with it. You are escorted across the tarmac, and that is when you first see it. The Stratoliner sits there in the grey morning light like something that does not quite belong to the same era as the aircraft around it. It is large, genuinely, surprisingly large for its time. Its fuselage is wide and round, almost tubular in its fullness, and it towers above the ground on a set of massive radial-engined wings that stretch out with real authority. It has 4 engines, each one a Wright GR-1820 Cyclone capable of generating over 1,000 horsepower. But what strikes you most is not its power. It is the shape. It is the width. It is the quiet suggestion, even from outside, that the interior of this machine is going to be something different, and you have no idea yet how right you are. Or here is what most people do not know about the Boeing 307 Stratoliner. It was the first commercial airliner in the world to feature a pressurized cabin. Not partially pressurized, not artificially oxygenated, fully pressurized in a sealed environment engineered to maintain the equivalent of an 8,000-foot altitude even when the aircraft was cruising at well above 20,000 feet. Now, to understand why that matters, to truly feel why that matters, you need to understand what flying was like before the Stratoliner arrived. In the 1930s, commercial aviation was not for the faint of heart. It was not, as the travel posters suggested, a serene glide through the clouds. It was a trial. An aircraft flew at relatively low altitudes, typically between 6,000 and 12,000 feet, which meant they flew through weather rather than above it. Turbulence was not an occasional inconvenience, it was a constant companion. Passengers were offered oxygen masks for prolonged climbs. They were advised not to eat heavily before departure. The cabins were loud, genuinely, relentlessly loud, because there was no insulation worth speaking of, and the engines thundered just outside the window. People arrived at their destinations exhausted, sometimes ill, almost always dehydrated and disoriented. And then there was the altitude itself. The human body begins to feel the effects of reduced oxygen pressure at altitudes above 10,000 feet. Headaches, fatigue, a subtle but persistent sense of unease. Flying for several hours at 12,000 feet in an unpressurized cabin was physiologically taxing in ways that most passengers simply endured because they had no alternative. The Stratoliner changed all of that. When Boeing's engineers designed this aircraft, drawing heavily from the structural lineage of the B-17 Flying Fortress bomber, they built a fuselage that was essentially a sealed pressure vessel. Air was pumped into the cabin and maintained at a consistent, comfortable pressure. The temperature was regulated. The humidity, within limits, was controlled. For the first time in the history of commercial aviation, passengers did not need to dress warmly for a flight. They did not need oxygen supplements. They could sit in their shirt sleeves and feel, genuinely feel, as though they were in a finely appointed room rather than a tube hurtling through the atmosphere. The engineering achievement here was extraordinary. This is where one begins to understand that the Stratoliner was not simply a better airplane. It was a different category of experience altogether. It redefined what being a passenger meant. But let us talk about what was inside, because that is where the story becomes truly extraordinary. TWA, under the driving vision of its principal owner, Howard Hughes, yes, that Howard Hughes, had ordered 5 Boeing 307s, and they spared nothing in their configuration. The aircraft could carry 33 passengers in a day configuration, but TWA's Stratoliners were designed with a clear philosophy. Fewer passengers, more space, more comfort, more spectacle. Gordon, you walked through the main cabin door and entered a world that had been conceived not by engineers first, but by designers. The interior was the work of Raymond Loewy's contemporaries, artists and decorators who understood that the wealthy traveler of 1940 expected something very particular from a luxury experience. The colors were warm and coordinated, soft greens, tan leathers, ivory panels. There was none of the institutional uniformity that we now associate with aviation. Every surface had been considered. The window reveals were curved and clean. The overhead panels were smooth and continuous. There was something almost oceanic about the proportions, something that reminded a passenger not of a vehicle, but of a vessel. And the seats. Let us spend a moment on the seats. In the standard day configuration, passengers sat in wide, deeply cushioned reclining chairs, genuinely wide, in a cabin whose interior diameter was significantly greater than any airliner that had come before. You were not folding yourself into an assigned slot. You were settling into a chair. There was room beside you and above you. The windows were large enough that you could lean towards them and look out without pressing your face against the glass. The armrests were broad. The seat pitch, the distance between rows, was generous by any standard of any era. But TWA also offered a night sleeper configuration on certain routes, in which some of these seats were converted into proper sleeping berths, much like the compartments of a luxury Pullman railway car. The berths were curtained for privacy. They were long enough for a tall man to stretch out fully, and they were oriented so that a passenger lying on their side could, if the night were clear, watch the stars slide past the window at altitude. Can you imagine that? Lying in a made-up berth with pressed linen at 20,000 feet, watching the stars? In 1940? Now let us talk about that observatory. The most remarkable feature of the Boeing 307 Stratoliner, the detail that, more than any other, separates it from everything that came before and, arguably, much of what has come since, was a feature that TWA offered on certain configurations and certain routes, and which has become, for those who know about it, almost the defining symbol of what this aircraft represented. Because of the Stratoliner's exceptional ceiling, it could cruise comfortably above 20,000 feet. Far above the weather systems that plagued lower-flying aircraft, TWA was able to market something to its passengers that no airline had ever been able to offer before with any consistency: the guarantee of clear skies. Below the Stratoliner, on most routes and most nights, the cloud cover was a flaw rather than an obstacle. The turbulence was behind and beneath. The aircraft moved through air that was genuinely, serenely smooth. And the sky at that altitude, particularly at night, was not the sky you know from the ground. It was darker. The stars were more numerous, more defined, more startlingly present. The curvature of the Earth was almost perceptible on clear days at the aircraft's maximum altitude. And the light, the particular quality of light at altitude, whether the pale silver of a crescent moon or the faint rose of a dawn approached from above the clouds, was something that no passenger had ever reliably seen from a commercial aircraft before. TWA understood, with considerable marketing intelligence, that this was not merely a practical advantage, it was an experience, and they sold it as one. The forward section of certain Stratoliner configurations included panoramic windows specifically positioned and angled to maximize the view upward and outward. In some accounts from the period, including descriptions left by journalists and passengers who flew these routes in the early 1940s, the forward observation area of the aircraft was referred to, both formally and colloquially, as a sky lounge, a place where passengers could gather, standing or seated on a curved bench, and to look outward and upward into a sky that was theirs exclusively for the duration of the flight. The most surprising thing is that this really happened. This was not a marketing brochure fantasy. Passengers of that era wrote about it. They described standing at altitude and looking up through that curved glass at a universe that felt impossibly close, a universe that the thunderstorm a mile below them could not reach. There was something in that experience that is almost impossible to translate into the language of modern aviation. Today, if we want to see the sky from an airplane, we tilt a shade and look at a small rectangle of atmosphere. We wear noise-cancelling headphones. We watch a screen. The sky is incidental. It is backdrop. It is the thing outside. On the Stratoliner, the sky was the reason you were there. But let us place this aircraft in its full historical context, because the Stratoliner did not appear from nowhere, and understanding where it came from makes it all the more remarkable. Boeing had been developing the Model 307 since the mid-1930s, and the project was deeply intertwined with one of the most famous aircraft of the Second World War. The Stratoliner's fuselage was an entirely new pressurized design, but its wings, engines, tail assembly, and much of its structural engineering were derived directly from the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, the legendary heavy bomber that would go on to define American strategic air power in the coming conflict. This was not coincidence. It was deliberate. Boeing wanted to use proven military technology as the foundation for a revolutionary civilian aircraft, and the B-17's exceptional performance at high altitude was precisely what made that vision possible. The first flight of the Model 307 took place on the 31st of December, 1938, a date that feels almost symbolic. On the last night of a year that was itself a kind of ending, Europe was teetering, the world was changing, and here was Boeing, flying a pressurized airliner above the clouds and showing, in the most literal sense possible, that the future belonged to those willing to operate above the weather. Only 10 Boeing 307 Stratoliners were ever built. 10. In a world of hundreds of DC-3s and dozens of competing aircraft types, only 10 of these machines existed. 5 went to TWA, 3 went to Pan American World Airways, and 1 was delivered to Howard Hughes personally. We will return to that extraordinary detail in a moment. And 1 prototype was retained by Boeing for testing. The rarity of this aircraft is not incidental to its story. It is central to it. The Stratoliner was a machine produced in such limited numbers, for such a specific clientele, operating on such specific routes, that the experience of flying on one was statistically extraordinary even in its own time. Most Americans in 1940 had never flown at all. Of those who had, the great majority had flown on DC-3s or earlier types, at low altitude, through weather, without pressurization. The number of people who had experienced the Stratoliner at altitude, in clear air, above the clouds, was genuinely tiny. It was a club of experience so exclusive that its members could have fit together, or into one of the aircraft's own cabins. Pan American's 3 Stratoliners deserve particular attention because they represented a different application of the same extraordinary machine, and a different vision of what luxury at altitude could mean. Pan Am's aircraft were configured for longer routes, including routes that crossed the Caribbean and extended toward South America. The airline designated these aircraft the S-307, and they were fitted with a somewhat different interior philosophy than TWA's transcontinental birds. Pan Am, under the formidable guidance of Juan Tripper, was already operating its legendary flying boats, the Boeing 314 Clippers, on transatlantic and trans-Pacific routes, and those aircraft had established a standard of on-board hospitality that was, in many ways, even more opulent than what the Stratoliner offered. The Clippers had dining rooms, they had dressing rooms, they had promenade decks, they had, in some configurations, honeymoon suites. The Stratoliner could not match the sheer spatial grandeur of a flying boat. But it offered something the Clippers could not: the altitude, the weather immunity, the smooth, pressurized, star-filled crossing above the clouds while the ocean below was lashed by squalls that the Clipper, tethered to sea-level operations, could not escape. What Pan Am's Stratoliner passengers received was a cabin that was, by the standards of any land plane of its era, extraordinarily well appointed. The seats were wider than most of their competitors. The service, conducted by male stewards in the Pan Am tradition, was attentive and discreet. Meals were served on proper crockery, with silverware that felt substantial in the hand, accompanied by wines selected from Pan Am's own list, which was maintained with the seriousness of a good restaurant cellar. But what the passengers talked about, what appeared again and again in the letters and diaries and travel pieces of the period, was not the food or the service. It was the flight itself. It was what it felt like to be in that pressurized tube at altitude, to feel no turbulence, to hear, relatively, so little engine noise compared to what they were used to look out the window and see not weather and cloud and murk, but simply sky. Now let us talk about Howard Hughes, because no story about TWA's Stratoliners is complete without him. Howard Hughes, in 1939, was not yet the reclusive eccentric who would eventually become one of the 20th century's most haunting figures. He was, at that moment, arguably the most glamorous man in America. An aviator, a filmmaker, a businessman, an innovator, and a billionaire, when billionaires were truly, astonishingly rare, who approached every domain he entered with a combination of obsessive perfectionism and unlimited resources that produced results no one else could quite match. Hughes had acquired a controlling interest in TWA in 1939, and he immediately set about transforming the airline into something that reflected his own extraordinarily high standards for aviation. He was personally involved in the selection and configuration of the Stratoliners. He flew them himself repeatedly. He knew their systems with the intimacy of an engineer, and he understood their ceilings and their limitations and their capabilities in a way that most airline owners of any era simply do not. And then he did something that no one had done before and very few have done since. He took delivery of a Boeing 307 Stratoliner for his own personal use, not for TWA, not for commercial operation. For himself. A private aircraft configured to his own specifications, that was effectively a private flying apartment at 20,000 feet. This aircraft, which Hughes eventually registered as NX-1, was fitted out as a personal transport with all the peculiarities and refinements that Hughes's imagination could produce. It was the first truly significant private wide-body aircraft in history. It had a bedroom. It had a sitting area. It had a galley configured for extended travel. It had communication equipment that allowed Hughes to maintain contact with his business operations from altitude. It was, in every meaningful sense, a flying office and home. Hughes flew this aircraft on personal trips, on business expeditions, on the kind of long-distance journeys that, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, still had the quality of adventure. And because he was Howard Hughes, because he was both the owner and the pilot, a man accountable to no one for the quality of his own experience, he operated the aircraft with a combination of technical excellence and personal indulgence that made it something entirely without precedent. He would fly at altitude, he would fly at night, he would, by some accounts, climb to the aircraft's ceiling and simply cruise there in the darkness, watching the stars. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. But we should speak now about what it actually felt like to cross America on a Stratoliner, because the route itself, the transcontinental route that TWA operated between New York and Los Angeles, was one of the great journeys of its era, and the Stratoliner transformed it in ways that passengers felt viscerally. Before the Stratoliner, a transcontinental crossing was a full day's enterprise, subject to the whims of weather, the grinding discomfort of an unpressurized cabin, and the multiple fuel stops that aircraft of the era required. The journey took somewhere between 15 and 17 hours, depending on conditions. It was tiring in the way that any demanding physical ordeal is tiring, not dramatically, not acutely, but cumulatively. In the way that hours of vibration and altitude and engine noise and turbulent air deposit their fatigue in a body that has had no real chance to rest. The Stratoliner changed the arithmetic of that crossing in several ways. Its cruising altitude, typically between 14 and 20,000 feet, above the worst of the weather, meant that the turbulence experienced by passengers was markedly reduced. Its pressurized cabin meant that bodies did not have to fight against altitude. Its 4 powerful Wright Cyclone engines and cleaner aerodynamics meant that cruising speeds were higher, around 220 miles per hour compared to the DC-3's 170 or so, which shaved meaningful time from the crossing. TWA advertised the transcontinental route on the Stratoliner at roughly 11.5 hours, with stops, which was a genuine and perceptible improvement on what had come before. But it was not just the time. It was the quality of those hours. A passenger who boarded a Stratoliner in New York could, by the time the aircraft was cruising over Pennsylvania, begin to feel something that was genuinely novel. Ease. Not comfort in the compensatory sense, not the managed discomfort of a slightly better seat, but actual, unmanaged ease. The cabin was warm. The pressure was comfortable. The aircraft was moving smoothly through air that did not fight back. There was, genuinely, time and permission to relax. Meals were served during the crossing, proper meals, not the wrapped provisions of earlier air travel. The TWR had designed a galley service that reflected the airline's determination to compete not just with other airlines, but with the dining car tradition of the luxury railways. There were multiple courses, served on trays with cloth napkins. There was wine. And this matters because at altitude, in an unpressurized aircraft, wine is not particularly pleasant. But in the Stratoliner's pressurized environment, a glass of Burgundy or a dry martini could be enjoyed with something close to the same pleasure as on the ground. The effect of alcohol at altitude is different when the cabin altitude is maintained at 8,000 feet rather than 20,000. Passengers could actually taste what they were drinking. Can you imagine boarding an aircraft and finding this? A proper meal service, wine you could taste, a pressurized cabin, and a sky that looked like a planetarium above you? There were also, on some configurations and some routes, stewardesses. TWA was among the airlines that had introduced female cabin attendants in the late 1930s, and the particular character of Stratoliner service was marked by its attentiveness and its unhurriedness. Because the passengers were paying significant sums, and because there were relatively few of them in the cabin at any time, the crew-to-passenger ratio was more favorable than on any aircraft operating today. A passenger could request something and receive it. A passenger with a specific preference, a particular drink, a particular temperature, and a request to be woken at a specific time during a night crossing, would find that request honored without the kind of institutional friction that has become the defining feature of modern air travel. This is where one begins to understand that this was a different way of traveling, not different in degree, different in kind. Let us also speak about what the Stratoliner offered that no brochure could quite capture: the emotional texture of the experience. There is something particular about being at altitude in a pressurized aircraft that has nothing to do with technology and everything to do with psychology. When you are at 20,000 feet in a comfortable, well-appointed cabin, sealed from the outside world but looking out at it through a large, clean window, something happens to your sense of proportion. The ordinary concerns of life, the telephone calls not yet made, the letters not yet answered, the appointments not yet kept, recede in a way they simply do not on the ground. The aircraft is a kind of parenthesis. You are genuinely between places, and because you are between places, you are also, in some small but real sense, between times, neither here nor there, neither before nor after. For the passengers of 1940, this feeling was dramatically amplified by the fact that communication was simply not possible in flight. There were no in-flight telephones. There were no telegrams from altitude. Once you boarded the Stratoliner and the door was closed and the engines were running, you were unreachable. The world could not get to you. And in a decade that was beginning to feel, for anyone paying attention, but like the opening movement of something very loud and very terrible. That unreachability was not merely pleasant. It was profound. The men, and they were predominantly men, though not exclusively, who flew the Stratoliner in those years between 1940 and the American entry into the Second World War in December of 1941, were often the kind of men for whom the world's intrusions were constant and costly. Business executives managing enterprises that spanned the continent, government officials carrying the weight of decisions that would shape the country's response to the gathering war in Europe, politicians and diplomats for whom every public appearance was managed and every conversation was calculated. These were men who did not often experience genuine quiet. The Stratoliner gave them quiet, not complete quiet. The engines were still present, and at altitude there is always a sound to the air around an aircraft. But a relative quiet, a managed and comfortable quiet that was unlike anything else available to a traveler of that era. And they valued it. In the letters and accounts that survive from this period, this quality, the quiet, the peace, the sense of suspension above the world, appears again and again. It was, for many of these passengers, one of the most unexpected and cherished aspects of the experience. Now, we should speak honestly about the Stratoliner's vulnerabilities, because this is not a story of uncomplicated triumph. The aircraft had its shadows, and any account that ignores them is incomplete. The most significant shadow fell on the 1st of February, 1939, when the second Stratoliner prototype was lost in a catastrophic accident over Mount Rainier in Washington state. The aircraft, which was being demonstrated to a group of KLM Royal Dutch Airlines executives who were considering purchasing the type, encountered severe structural failure during a high-altitude stall test that had not been properly coordinated with the pilot. All 10 people aboard were killed. It was one of the most significant aviation accidents of the pre-war period, and it cast a pall over the Stratoliner program at a moment when Boeing was hoping to accelerate orders. The investigation revealed not a fundamental flaw in the Stratoliner's design. The aircraft was structurally sound, but a failure of procedure, and a case of multiple parties with different understandings of who was responsible for the aircraft's handling at a critical moment. Boeing addressed the findings, made modifications to the aircraft systems, and continued production. But the accident had consequences. The order from KLM, which had looked promising, did not materialize. And the Stratoliner's commercial life, already limited by its extraordinary price and by the relatively small number of operators who could afford to put it into service, was further constrained. There were also, in the early months of TWA's operations, mechanical challenges of the kind that any first-generation pressurized aircraft was going to encounter. The sealing systems required maintenance attention that ground crews were not always well prepared for. The pressurization equipment was temperamental in specific weather conditions. There were flights that had to descend to lower altitudes when pressurization issues arose, descents that were, for passengers who had just experienced the serenity of a smooth, high-altitude crossing, jarring in ways that went beyond the physical. And then, in a stroke of timing so terrible that it reads almost like a plot device, the world changed in a way that made all of this largely irrelevant. On the 7th of December, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the Second World War, and within weeks the Boeing 307 Stratoliners were requisitioned. The military took the Stratoliners. All of them, or very nearly. The Army Air Corps, soon to become the Army Air Forces, had immediate use for pressurized, long-range, and high-altitude aircraft capable of carrying important personnel, sensitive cargo, and communications equipment across great distances with reliability. The Stratoliner fitted that requirement precisely. Under the military designation C-75, the aircraft was stripped of their luxurious interiors, their sky lounges and their leather reclining chairs and their galley services were removed, and they were reconfigured for the entirely different priorities of wartime transport. The elegance was gone. The cabin altitude was maintained not for passenger comfort, but for operational efficiency. The routes flown were not the Los Angeles to New York run with its dinner service and its star-lit windows, but the supply lines of a world at war, the North Atlantic route, the South Atlantic crossing, the routes across the Pacific, and the legs to North Africa and the Middle East and the China-Burma-India theater. These aircraft flew hundreds of thousands of miles in military service, and they performed with a reliability that reflected the fundamental soundness of their engineering. But the men who flew them, the military crews, the essential passengers of wartime, were not there to experience the sky. They were there to get somewhere, as quickly and as safely as possible, in the service of something larger than any luxury. The Stratoliner's great civilian era, the era of the pressurized sky lounge, the star-lit crossing, the champagne at 20,000 feet, had lasted less than 2 years. From the spring of 1940, when TWA placed its first aircraft in commercial service, to the winter of 1941, when the war took them away. Less than 2 years. And here, I think, it is the moment to pause and feel the weight of that. All of that engineering, all of that design, all of that vision of what air travel could be, of passengers seated in comfort above the weather, looking up through curved glass at a universe that the ground could not reach. And it was available to the traveling public for less than 24 months. In that time, the number of people who actually flew on a Stratoliner in commercial service, in those pressurized cabins with those sky views, on those transcontinental and Caribbean routes, was measured in the thousands at most, perhaps considerably fewer. The most surprising thing is that it happened at all. After the war, the Stratoliners were returned to their civilian operators, but they were not the same aircraft. The military had used them hard. The interiors were gone. The specialized pressurization equipment was worn, and the world had changed around them in ways that made their original vision both more and less relevant. More relevant because the war had proved beyond any doubt that pressurized high-altitude flight was the future of aviation. The aircraft that emerged from the wartime programs, the Lockheed Constellation, the Douglas DC-6, the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, were all pressurized, all fast, all capable of operating above the weather. The Stratoliner's central innovation had been vindicated and surpassed by the technology it had pioneered. Less relevant, because the aircraft itself was now, by the standards of post-war aviation, outpaced. Its 4 Wright Cyclone engines produced less power than the new generation of radial power plants. Its speed, which had seemed extraordinary in 1940, and it was modest against the Constellations and the DC-4s that were now entering service. And its capacity, 33 passengers in luxury configuration, was small against aircraft that could carry 60, 70, 80 passengers on the same routes. TWA refurbished their Stratoliners after the war, restoring interiors to something approaching the pre-war standard, though not quite reaching the original heights of the 1940 configuration, and put them back on domestic routes. But it was clear to everyone who was paying attention that these aircraft were not the future. They were the past, still flying, still beautiful, still offering a quality of experience that most of the new equipment could not quite match in every dimension, but flying against time rather than with it. And the last commercial operations of the original TWA Stratoliners wound down in the early 1950s. One by one, the aircraft were retired, sold, transferred. Some went to smaller operators, some were converted for cargo, some were grounded and stripped of usable components. The world moved on, as the world always does, with a casualness about its miracles that only becomes apparent much later, when there are none left. And then there is the matter of what became of Howard Hughes's personal Stratoliner, that singular aircraft, that private flying apartment, that embodiment of one man's vision of what altitude and comfort and solitude could mean to someone with the resources to demand all 3 simultaneously. Hughes eventually had his personal Stratoliner modified at considerable expense, adding long-range fuel tanks and navigation equipment that allowed it to be used for serious long-distance travel. He flew it on several extended journeys in the years after the war, and then, as his life began its long, strange descent into the isolation and complexity that would define his later decades, the aircraft sat. It sat in various hangars in the American Southwest, maintained but not flown, a kind of monument to the man's earlier self, the man who had flown around the world in record time, who had broken transcontinental speed records, who had stood at the controls of his own pressurized airliner at altitude and looked out at a sky that belonged to him. The aircraft was eventually sold, passed through several hands, and ended its days in circumstances that were, given its origins, poignant. It was destroyed in the Labor Day hurricane of 1950, which struck the Florida coast and left the aircraft, by then operating with an airline called Cubana, beyond repair. Of the 10 Boeing 307 Stratoliners ever built, only 1 survives today. A single aircraft. It is preserved at the National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center near Washington, D.C. It is a Pan-American Airways aircraft, the one that has traveled the longest and carried the most history, and it sits in that vast, quiet hangar alongside the Space Shuttle Discovery and the Concorde and the Enola Gay, in the company of machines that changed the world. When you stand beside it, and if you ever find yourself near Washington, I urge you to go. It is smaller than you expect, and more beautiful than any photograph has suggested. The curves of the fuselage have an organic quality, a roundness that feels more alive than the angular geometry of modern aircraft. The windows are positioned at a height that invites you to look in, and through them you can see the restored interior. The seats, the panels, the quality of the light that comes through those curved windows. And if you stand there long enough, in the right frame of mind, you can almost hear it. The sound of those 4 Wright Cyclones, the quality of the air in a pressurized cabin at altitude, the particular silence that follows when an aircraft finds smooth air above the clouds and the turbulence stops, and the world below becomes, suddenly and completely, someone else's problem. It is worth asking before we come to our conclusion why the Stratoliner was not more celebrated in its own time. Why did not more people know about it? Why did not more people fly on it? The answer is several things at once, and none of them are simple. It was expensive. In a country where most people had never flown at all, and where the depression of the 1930s had left lasting marks on the psychology of spending, an aircraft that charged $3,000 in today's money for a single transcontinental fare was not going to accumulate a large or diverse passenger base. The Stratoliner's clientele was always and necessarily a sliver of the traveling public, and that sliver, by its nature, was not inclined to publicize its own experiences with the enthusiasm of ordinary people discovering something remarkable. It was rare. 10 aircraft in the entire world, operating on a handful of routes. You had to know about it to seek it out, and the marketing of luxury in that era was conducted differently than today, quietly, selectively, by word of mouth in the right rooms and the right clubs, not by the broad broadcast methods that would later become the standard. And it was overtaken. The war came and rearranged everything. And after the war, aviation entered a new phase, faster, larger, more accessible, more democratic, in which the Stratoliner's particular qualities, as extraordinary as they were either surpassed by newer technology or simply left behind by a world in a hurry. The post-war traveler did not want to fly at 220 miles an hour. They wanted to fly at 300. They wanted to fly on a Constellation or a Stratocruiser or eventually a jet. The Stratoliner's grace was the grace of something that had arrived just a little too early and stayed just a little too briefly, and the world moved past it before it could leave the kind of deep impression that might have survived in popular memory. And yet here we are, more than 80 years later, and the story of the Boeing 307 Stratoliner still has the power to stop people in their tracks, still has the power to make a person, someone who flies today in a seat 2 inches wider than a Victorian railway carriage, eating a pre-packaged sandwich, watching a film on a screen the size of a paperback book, look up and think. That existed? People actually flew like that? They did. They flew at altitude, above the weather, in a pressurized cabin that kept their bodies comfortable and their minds clear. They sat in real chairs and ate from real plates and drank wine that tasted like wine. They looked out through large, clean windows at a sky that was theirs for the duration of the crossing. On certain routes, on certain nights, they stood at the forward observation area and looked upward through curved glass at a universe so close that it seemed almost impolite not to reach for it. They landed at their destinations without the residue of 8 hours of combat, with altitude and vibration and thin air. They arrived, if you can believe it, feeling well. And the last of those aircraft sits in a museum in Virginia, lit by the same flat light that illuminates everything in that vast hangar, surrounded by the neighbors it never expected to have, waiting for someone to walk up and recognize what it was. Now, I want to leave you with a question. And I want you to think about it genuinely, not just as a thought experiment, but as a real exercise in imagination. If you could have been one of those passengers, not just any passenger, but the right kind, which part of the Stratoliner experience would have moved you most? Would it have been the pressurized cabin, the simple, revolutionary act of flying in comfort without fighting the altitude? Would it have been the meal service, the glass of wine at 20,000 feet that tasted the way wine is supposed to taste? Would it have been the silence, the smooth air above the clouds, the profound and unreachable quiet of a cabin above the weather, while the world below was dark and distant? Or would it have been that moment at the observation windows, that particular, impossible, and almost meditative moment of standing in a glass room above the clouds and looking up at the stars? I think about this question often. I think about what it would mean to experience travel as a genuine act of departure, not just from a place, but from the conditions of ordinary life. The Stratoliner offered that. For a brief, brilliant, barely noticed window of time, in the years just before the world changed irrevocably, It offered a crossing that was also, in the truest sense, a journey. Not from city to city, from one state of being to another. We have gained so much since then. We have jets that cross oceans in 7 hours. We have pressurized cabins on every commercial aircraft. We have navigation systems and weather avoidance technology that would have seemed like wizardry to the engineers who designed the Stratoliner. We have, in business class and first class, approximations of comfort that in some dimensions genuinely surpass what the Stratoliner offered. But we have lost something too, something that is harder to name and harder to replace. The sense that the sky itself was the destination. The sense that the quality of the crossing mattered as much as its outcome. The sense, that very particular, very unrepeatable sense, that to be at altitude, in a pressurized cabin, above the clouds and the weather and the ordinary world, was to be somewhere genuinely extraordinary. Not merely in transit, not merely between places, but somewhere. The Boeing 307 Stratoliner understood that. Its engineers and its designers and its operators understood that. Howard Hughes, whatever else one might say about him, understood it. The passengers who flew those routes in 1940 and 1941, in the last months before the war took everything away, they understood it. The question we might ask ourselves, as we board our next flight and fold ourselves into our assigned places and wait for the screen in front of us to offer something to watch, is whether we still understand it. Whether the sky, as we cross it, still means anything to us. Whether we look out the window. Whether we feel, even for a moment, that where we are is extraordinary. I believe it still can. I believe that is part of why you are here, watching this, spending time with a story about an aircraft that most of the world has forgotten. Because something in you recognizes that travel once meant more than movement, that the altitude once meant something, that the sky, seen from above, was a privilege worth honoring. If this story moved you, if it awakened something in you, a sense of awe, a feeling of nostalgia for a world you never inhabited but somehow recognize, then I ask you to leave a comment below. Tell me which part of the Stratoliner experience you would have most wanted to live through. The pressurized crossing above the clouds, the meal service at altitude, the sky lounge and its particular meditative silence, the starlit berth on a night crossing, or simply the act of boarding, that moment on the tarmac when you first saw the aircraft and understood that what was about to happen was unlike anything you had experienced before. Tell me. Because these stories are only worth telling if someone is still listening. And the fact that you have stayed with me until this last sentence tells me that you are exactly the kind of person I built this channel for. If you are new here, and this is the first story you have found on this channel, then welcome. There are many more waiting for you. Stories of flying boats and airships, of ocean liner interiors carried into the sky, of aircraft so large and so opulent that they make the Stratoliner look almost modest by comparison. Subscribe. Stay. We have places to go together, and none of them are anywhere near the ground. And share this video. Share it with someone who loves history. Share it with someone who remembers a world when things were built with ambition and care. Share it with someone who still looks out the window when they fly. Because those people deserve to know that once, a very long time ago, an aircraft took off into the blue and climbed above the clouds and offered its passengers the sky. And it was, by every account of those who were fortunate enough to experience it, every bit as extraordinary as it sounds. Thank you for traveling with me today. Until next time, keep looking up.